Welcome to our deep dive into the world of magic mushrooms. I bet a lot of you listening are curious about these
Right.
fungi, their history, their effects, and all the buzz about their potential, therapeutic uses.
Right.
So we've got a fascinating mix of sources for this one,
We do.
from ancient texts to cutting-edge research, and it all seems to point to this long relationship
Yeah,
between humans and magic mushrooms.
for sure. And it goes back thousands of years. It's a story that spans cultures and continents.
Wow.
And it really highlights how these mushrooms have captured the human imagination for millennia.
Exactly. And the fact that scientists are now exploring their potential to treat like depression and anxiety makes the whole thing even more intriguing. It's like we're rediscovering an ancient secret.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's almost like we've come full circle.
So to really understand what's happening now,
Mm.
I think we need to go back to the beginning,
Okay.
way back, like
Mhm.
prehistoric rock art in Algeria.
Oh, wow.
Kind of back.
That's right. There's evidence suggesting that people were using magic mushrooms as far back as 9,000 to 7,000 BCE
Really?
in North Africa. And some of that rock art seems to depict not just the mushrooms themselves, but also figures
Oh,
that
that-
could represent like the transformations people felt under their influence.
Whoa, that's amazing. So even back then, people were recognizing that these mushrooms had a powerful effect on
Yeah.
consciousness.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just in Africa. In Spain, there's evidence of a species called Psilocybe hispanica
Okay.
being used in rituals around 6,000 years ago.
Wow.
So clearly, this wasn't just some isolated phenomenon.
It makes you wonder what those early experiences were like. What did they think was happening? Were they trying to connect with spirits, explore different realms of
Wow.
consciousness?
It's fascinating to speculate, isn't it?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we can only glean so much from archaeological evidence.
Right.
But when we fast forward to the time of the Aztecs in Mesoamerica, we start to get a clearer picture.
Oh, yeah, Mesoamerica. That's where the whole divine mushroom thing comes in.
Right.
Right.
Exactly. The Aztecs and other indigenous groups in that region had a deep reverence for these mushrooms.
Okay.
They called them Tichnacatl,
Tichinacat.
which literally translates to divine mushroom.
Interesting.
And they weren't just using them recreationally.
From what I've read, they were using magic mushrooms for all sorts of things, religious ceremonies, healing rituals,
Yeah.
even divination. It's almost like they saw these mushrooms as a way to communicate with the gods or
Mhm.
tap into hidden knowledge.
Precisely. And we have firsthand accounts from Spanish conquistadors who witnessed these practices.
Oh, wow.
Bernardino de Sahagún, for example, described how magic mushrooms were used in the coronation of Moctezuma II, the Aztec emperor.
Wow.
They were a central part of their spiritual and cultural life.
So we're talking about a deeply embedded tradition, not just some passing fad.
Right. And it's important to note that the use of magic mushrooms in Mesoamerica wasn't limited to the elite. They were used by people from all walks of life, often under the guidance of shamans or healers.
It's kind of mind-blowing to think that this knowledge and these traditions have been passed down
I know.
for generations, even though they were actively suppressed
Right.
by the Spanish conquistadors.
Sadly, the Spanish conquest led to a period of intense persecution.
Oh, no.
Magic mushroom ceremonies, along with many other indigenous practices, were seen as a threat to
Yeah.
the Catholic Church and were ruthlessly suppressed.
It's a tragic part of the story, but it's also remarkable that despite this persecution, the use of magic mushrooms persisted in some areas,
It did.
often in secrecy. And that brings us to the 20th century
Yeah.
and the Wassons, right?
Absolutely. This is where the story takes a fascinating turn.
Okay.
Valentina and R. Gordon Wasson were a couple who were fascinated by ethnomycology,
That's the mycology.
the study of the relationship between people and fungi.
Interesting.
And in the 1950s, they traveled to Mexico specifically to research the use of magic mushrooms.
I've read a bit about them.
Yeah.
They weren't just observing these ceremonies from afar. They actually participated, right?
Yes, and that was pretty groundbreaking for Westerners at the time. They immersed themselves in the culture, built relationships with local curanderos,
Vados.
healers, and even took part in mushroom ceremonies themselves.
What was it like for them? I mean, going from their Western worldview into this completely different realm of consciousness, it must have been a pretty wild ride.
It was. And their experiences really challenged their preconceived notions about these mushrooms.
Okay.
In their 1957 article in Life magazine, Valentina described the experience as ecstasy
Yeah.
and a sense of oneness with nature. R. Gordon, on the other hand, had a more challenging experience initially, but ultimately gained a deep appreciation
Interesting.
for the spiritual significance of these rituals.
It's interesting that they had such different experiences even though they were in the same setting.
Yeah.
It really speaks to the subjective nature of these mushrooms.
Absolutely.
Right.
And their work played a key role in bringing magic mushrooms into the public consciousness
Okay.
of the Western world.
So they basically opened the door for the psychedelic revolution
Yeah.
of the 1960s.
In a way, yes. Their research piqued the interest of scientists like Roger Heim, who helped identify the specific species
Hmm.
of mushrooms the Watsons brought back from Mexico.
Okay.
And then, of course, there was Albert Hoffman.
Wait, the Albert Hoffman, the
Oh,
guy who
yeah.
discovered LSD,
That's right. Hoffman was intrigued by the Watsons' findings
right?
and began studying the chemical composition of magic mushrooms.
So he...
He was the one who isolated and identified psilocybin and psilocin,
Okay.
the active compounds responsible for the psychedelic effects.
Wow, so the guy who synthesized LSD also played a role in unlocking the secrets of magic mushrooms.
That's an incredible connection. It's like
Yeah.
these two worlds were destined to collide.
And that collision really set the stage for the psychedelic renaissance
Okay.
of the 1960s,
Yeah.
which we'll delve into the next part. Okay, I am officially hooked. I can't wait to hear what happens next. Okay, so we've journeyed from prehistoric cave paintings to the discovery of psilocybin by the same guy who brought us LSD. Feels like things are about to get really interesting as we enter the 1960s.
You're right, the 60s were a pivotal time for psychedelics in general, and magic mushrooms were definitely part of that cultural wave. Remember Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert?
Oh yeah, the Harvard guys. Weren't they running some pretty controversial experiments with psilocybin?
They sure were. Their Harvard psilocybin project started with a lot of academic curiosity, exploring the effects of psilocybin on everything from creativity to religious experiences. They were giving psilocybin to students prisoners, even clergy.
Wow, talk about pushing the boundaries. I can only imagine the kind of reactions it must have sparked, especially back then.
It definitely raised eyebrows. There were concerns about the ethics of their methods, and some argued that they weren't being rigorous enough in their scientific approach. Ultimately, the project was shut down, and both Leary and Alpert were dismissed from Harvard.
That's kind of a wild story. But even though their project was controversial, it feels like they played a role in opening up this whole conversation about psychedelics.
Absolutely. Their work, combined with the growing counterculture movement of the 60s, led to a massive surge in interest and use of magic mushrooms. People were experimenting with altered states of consciousness, questioning authority, and looking for spiritual enlightenment. It was a time of great social and cultural upheaval, and psychedelics became a symbol of that change.
So from ancient rituals to hushed academic research, magic mushrooms were suddenly thrust onto the world stage. It's like they went from a secret society to a global phenomenon practically overnight.
That's a great way to put it. And speaking of a global phenomenon, one thing that's truly amazing about magic mushrooms is their sheer diversity. They're not just confined to a few specific regions. We're talking about hundreds of species found all over the planet.
Yeah, I was blown away to learn that there are over 100 species of psilocybin alone, and they're found on every continent. It's crazy to think that these potent little fungi are popping up in forests and fields all over the world.
It really is. They're particularly concentrated in subtropical humid forests, but you can find them in some pretty surprising places. And here's where it gets really interesting. The potency can vary wildly, even within the same species.
So even if you're an experienced mushroom enthusiast, I'm not sure what the cool kids are calling themselves these days, you can't just assume you know what you're getting into based on looks alone.
Right, exactly. A great example is Psilocybe azurescens, which is sometimes called the flying saucer mushroom. It's known for being incredibly potent. Some varieties contain up to 1.78% psilocybin, making it one of the strongest species out there.
Wow, 1.78%. That's a lot. So we're talking about a huge E range in potency, which probably explains why some experiences are gentle and introspective, while others are completely mind-blowing.
Precisely. And it's not just the amount of psilocybin that matters. Remember we talked about how magic mushrooms contain a whole cocktail of chemicals?
Right. It's not just psilocybin and psilocybin. You mentioned other compounds like baeocystin and norbaeocystin.
And those can have subtle but noticeable effects on the overall experience. Baeocystin, for example, is thought to produce more visual effects, while norbaeocystin might contribute to more introspective or contemplative headspace.
So it's this intricate interplay of compounds that determines the specific flavor of the experience. It's like the difference between a single malt scotch and a blended whiskey. They both contain alcohol, but the flavor profiles are completely different.
That's a great analogy. And then you have the beta-carbolines, which can actually inhibit the enzyme that breaks down psilocybin in the body. This means they can potentially prolong or intensify the effects of the psilocybin.
Wow, it's like nature's built-in amplifier. So with all these variables in play, no two experiences are ever going to be exactly the same.
Exactly. And that makes studying the effects of magic mushrooms incredibly challenging because there are so many factors to consider. But let's move on to the part. I think you're really curious about the actual experience of taking magic mushrooms. What happens when you ingest these compounds and they start interacting with your brain?
I'm all ears. This is where the mystery really starts to unfold. What kind of journey we're talking about here?
Well, it's important to remember that every trip is unique, influenced by a multitude of factors like your personality, mood, environment, and even your past experiences. But there are some common threads that weave through many accounts. One of the most fascinating aspects is the sensory shifts that people often report.
Okay, let's talk about the senses. What kind of sensory changes are we talking about here? I mean, I know there are hallucinations, but what does that actually look and feel like?
It can vary quite a bit, but on the visual side, you might see colors become more intense, patterns emerge on surfaces, or objects appear to breathe or warp. Some people experience closed-eye visuals, almost like waking dreams.
Yeah.
And then there are the auditory hallucinations. Music might sound incredibly profound. Everyday sounds might take on new meanings, or you might even hear things that aren't there at all.
It's like the brain is suddenly able to perceive a whole spectrum of reality that's normally hidden from view.
Exactly. And then you have synesthesia, which is where the senses get all mixed up.
Synesthesia.
You might see sounds as colors, or taste shapes, or feel emotions as physical sensations. It's a fascinating phenomenon that highlights just how profoundly psychedelics can alter our perception.
Synesthesia. That's always blown my mind. I've read about people who can taste words or see music as colors. It makes me wonder, what would it be like to actually experience reality that way? Would it be beautiful, overwhelming?
It's hard to say because it's so subjective, but it definitely speaks to the incredible plasticity of the brain and how our perceptions can be shifted in such dramatic ways. But it's important to remember that it's not just about sensory weirdness. Magic mushrooms can also produce very intense emotional experiences.
Right. I've heard about people having profound spiritual insights or feeling a deep sense of interconnectedness with everything around them.
That's right. And these emotional experiences are deeply intertwined with something called set and setting, which is a crucial concept to understand when it comes to psychedelics.
Set and setting. I've heard that term before, but I'm not sure I fully understand it. Can you break it down for me?
Of course. Set refers to your mindset going into the experience, your mood expectations, any anxieties you might be bringing with you. Setting is the environment you're in. Are you feeling safe and comfortable? Are you surrounded by people you trust? These factors can dramatically influence the direction of the trip, for better or worse.
So it's like if you go into the experience feeling stressed or anxious, or if you're in an environment that feels unsafe, you're more likely to have a challenging or even scary experience.
Exactly. A negative mindset or a chaotic environment can amplify any anxieties or fears that might arise during the trip. On the other hand, if you go into it with a positive mindset and you're in a comfortable and supportive setting, you're more likely to have a positive and even transformative experience.
It makes sense. It's like anything else in life, context matters. You wouldn't want to try skydiving for the first time during a thunderstorm, right?
Exactly. And it's the same with psychedelics. You want to set yourself up for success by creating a safe and supportive container for the experience. But even with the best set and setting, it's important to acknowledge that there are risks involved.
Right. I know people can have bad trips experiences that are frightening, confusing, or even traumatic.
Yes, and those experiences shouldn't be downplayed. It's important to approach these mushrooms with respect and caution, and to know that there's always a possibility of having a challenging experience.
So responsible use is key. But even with the potential risks, there's this growing interest in the therapeutic potential of psilocybin, right? It feels like we're witnessing a major shift in the way these substances are being perceived, moving away from the stigma of the drug war era and towards a more nuanced understanding of their potential benefits.
Absolutely. And that's what's so exciting about this field right now. We're seeing a resurgence of research into the therapeutic applications of psilocybin, and the results are incredibly promising. In fact, the FDA has even granted breakthrough therapy designation to psilocybin for the treatment of depression, which is a pretty big deal.
Breakthrough therapy designation, that sounds important. What does that actually mean in terms of the bigger picture?
It's basically the FDA's way of acknowledging that psilocybin shows significant potential for treating a serious condition, and it fast-tracks the development and review process for potential new therapies. There's growing evidence that psilocybin, when used in a controlled therapeutic setting, can help people with treatment-resistant depression, those who haven't found relief with traditional antidepressants.
So this isn't just about masking symptoms. We're
Yeah.
talking about the potential for deep and lasting healing.
That's the idea. The exact mechanisms are still being studied, but it seems that psilocybin can help break down rigid thought patterns, foster a sense of connection and openness, and even promote neurogenesis, the growth of new brain cells.
Whoa, neurogenesis. So we're talking about actually rewiring the brain.
In a sense, yes. It's almost like psilocybin can help create the conditions for the brain to heal and reorganize itself. And it's not just depression. Researchers are exploring the potential of psilocybin to treat anxiety, addiction, even end-of-life distress.
It's incredible to think that a substance that was once demonized and outlawed could hold the keys to treating so many different conditions. It's like we're finally starting to unlock its true potential.
Exactly. And speaking of unlocking potential, let's talk about the legal landscape surrounding magic mushrooms, because that's a whole other piece of this complex puzzle.
Right, because even though there's all this exciting research happening, magic mushrooms are still illegal in many places.
That's true. On an international level, psilocybin is a Schedule I drug, which means it's considered to have a high potential for abuse and no currently accepted medical use. But things are starting to change, particularly at the local level.
I'm thinking of places like Oregon, where psilocybin has been decriminalized and legalized for therapeutic use. That feels like a pretty big step.
It is, and it's not just Oregon. Other cities and states are considering similar measures. There's a growing movement to recognize the potential benefits of psilocybin and create safe and regulated frameworks for its use.
It feels like we're at a turning point. What was once seen as a dangerous drug is now being recognized as a potential medicine.
It's an exciting time to be following this field, that's for sure. We're seeing a convergence of ancient wisdom and modern science, and the possibilities seem endless. But with all this progress comes a whole new set of challenges. How do we balance the risks and benefits? How do we ensure responsible use? How do we integrate this ancient knowledge into our modern world? These are questions we'll be exploring in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, now I really can't wait for the next part. This is getting good. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, haven't we?
We have.
From ancient rituals to the counterculture to the, complexities of psilocybin's chemical makeup to its potential for healing.
Absolutely.
But I still feel like we're just scratching the surface here.
I think you're right. The conversation about magic mushrooms is far from over.
Yeah.
And it's one that's becoming increasingly relevant, as more research emerges and as the legal landscape shifts.
Exactly. And I think one of the biggest questions we're facing now, especially as places like Oregon, open the door to therapeutic use, is how do we navigate this new world responsibly? How do we balance the potential benefits with the potential risks?
Yeah, it's a crucial question, and there's no easy answer.
Right.
But one thing that's becoming clear is that education is key.
Yeah.
We need to move beyond the, fear-mongering and misinformation that has surrounded psychedelics for so long and start having open and honest conversations about the risks and benefits, the science, and the potential therapeutic applications.
It's like we need a whole new framework for understanding and approaching these substances.
Right.
One that's based on evidence, harm reduction, and respect for their power.
I couldn't agree more. We need to create safe and supportive environments for people to explore these experiences, whether it's in a therapeutic setting or in a more personal context. And that includes providing access to accurate information, integration support, and trained facilitators, who can help guide people through the experience.
Right, because even though we've talked about the potential for healing and transformation, it's important to remember that psilocybin is a powerful substance, and it's not for everyone.
For sure.
And even in the right setting, it can still be a challenging experience.
Absolutely. That's why responsible use also means being mindful of dosage intention and the importance of integration. It's not just about having a psychedelic experience, it's about what you do with that experience afterward.
Right.
How do you integrate those insights, those shifts in perspective into your everyday life?
Yeah. It's like the journey doesn't end when the trip is over. It's just the beginning of a whole new chapter.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting because the potential for personal growth and transformation is immense. But it's also where the need for responsible guidance and support becomes even more crucial.
I'm also thinking about the cultural implications of all this. I mean, magic mushrooms have been used in spiritual and ceremonial contexts for thousands of years.
Right.
And now they're entering the mainstream in a whole new way.
Yeah, it's definitely a time of great transition. And I think it's important to approach this with a sense of humility and respect for the traditions that have carried this knowledge for so long. We can learn a lot from indigenous cultures who have been working with these medicines for centuries, but we also need to be mindful of cultural appropriation,
Yeah.
ensure that any benefits are shared equitably.
It's a complex issue, but one that's worth grappling with. Because ultimately, this isn't just about magic mushrooms. It's about our relationship with altered states of consciousness, with the mysteries of the human mind, and with the potential for healing and transformation that lies within each of us.
Beautifully put. And I think that's a perfect note to end on.
So to our listener, we'll leave you with this as the world rediscovers the power of magic mushrooms. What role do you see them playing in our future? How will you navigate this evolving landscape? It's a question worth pondering as we all step into this brave new world of psychedelic exploration. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.